The one rule that I never could wrap my mind around was the no premarital sex rule. And I understand a lot of religions have that concept, but in the Mormon Church, you are literally taught that having sex outside of marriage is worse than murder, that it would be better for you to murder someone than have sex before marriage. I definitely was given boy toys, and I had a dirt bike when I was 12, and I went to Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, so I did do the male equivalent, I guess.
Were you an Eagle Scout, or did you not make it that far?
I did not make it that far.
Me neither. I was also in Boy Scouts. What about your dad?
My dad, he worked a lot. He was not around all that much because of his job. A lot of times my mom would just chase him off. He would come home and she'd start yelling and screaming at him until eventually he'd leave and go stay at a motel for a couple nights or something. Although he was around some when I was a kid, and he taught me a lot of stuff. When I was really little, he used to always have me hold the flashlight for him every time he was working on something. And so I just grew up learning how to do everything, working in cars, working on a house. And so I had that connection with him, but there wasn't that emotional availability, father connection for me. And then anytime he was around and my mom was yelling and screaming at him, he was in a low depressed state and distant from me anyway. So I did not have much of a father role in my home. Grandpa's was a raging, angry alcoholic, so I had that contrast to see.
Did you all live together, or was it like grandparents are close, but you don't live with them, but you still see them often? Or like, what was that dynamic?
My grandparents lived like 45-minute drive away, so we would see them fairly frequently.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious what it was like being in the church for you. You said you grew up in the church, and I'm not very familiar with Mormonism. You know, I just hear the stories on the street, right? But like, I'm curious what your experience with that was.
For the most part, since I was born into the church, I just accepted everything they taught me as true. I accepted that God and Jesus were these white bearded men that would descend out of the sky and talk to Joseph Smith and things, and I just accepted that. I accepted the rules and commandments in the church. And the one rule that I never could wrap my mind around was the no premarital sex rule. And I understand a lot of religions have that concept, but in the Mormon Church, you are literally taught that having sex outside of marriage is worse than murder, that it would be better for you to murder someone than have sex before marriage. And
really?
Yeah.
That's wild.
They say that. They straight up tell you that sexual sin is more grievous than any murder or any other sin you could make. So I grew up believing that my own body was wrong for having sexual feelings. Anytime sexual feelings would come up in them, I'd have to try to make sense of that somehow. And one of those things that I did with that was to evolve my sexual feelings of sexual attraction towards women to myself. And I guess that then again falls into that autogynephilia category. I'm not entirely sure. I don't know whether my life really aligns with that or not, because being taught that being sexually attracted to someone was so wrong and something you had to crush. I just grew up obviously with these natural sexual feelings happening in my body like happens to anybody or any male. And
any person really.
Right. I was told that's wrong. You can't have those feelings, especially you can't touch yourself. And so when I went through the temple, the Mormon temple, you have to make covenants with God in the temple. You raise your hand.
When is that? Like what age range, I guess?
That happens at 19 for boys.
Gotcha. So like late teens.
Yeah. And so at that point, I was fully immersed in the church, thought it was true. And so I went to the temple ready to make covenants with God that I was supposed to make. And one of the covenants in there was to covenant never to have sexual relations before marriage. And that one, I could never make that covenant. And I crossed my fingers behind my back when I made that covenant because I thought it was so ludicrous. And now, after leaving the church and realizing how insane that is.
When did you leave the church?
When I was 36, so it was 2016, I think.
What was that like? Like, experience, I guess?
That was scary, because when you grow up your entire life with your entire reality built around this church, the church feeds you this idea of who you are, why you're on this earth, where you're going after this life. And so I built my whole existence, my whole identity and reality around my beliefs in the church. And when they fell apart, when I realized it was all bogus, there's little truths scattered throughout it. But when I realized the reality of what the church was, I entered a serious state of being completely lost. I was lost for weeks, months, because I didn't know what to believe in now. What is God? What am I? What does God exist at all? And I entered a state of absolute atheism for a long time because I thought there's nothing out there. If this church wasn't true and this God wasn't true, then nothing exists. And that's not a fun place to be in either. A lot of people find happiness and comfort in atheism, but I personally found it to be a very lonely place where I had no guidance and no feeling of structure.
Yeah. Was your wife also Mormon? Is she also Mormon? Or is she not in the church?
She was never in the church. I married her fully convinced that I was going to get her to come into the church because as a Mormon, I was still a member when I met her, and it was her that kind of helped me come out. But I was fully convinced I was going to convince her to